Thomas Miller, a struggling single father, working as a janitor to support his asthmatic daughter, Sarah, accidentally walks into Apex Holdings' CEO Evelyn Croft's office late at night and unexpectedly discovers her hiding severe injuries from a helicopter crash while struggling to remove a painful spinal brace. Instead of exposing her secret, Thomas quietly leaves, earning Evelyn's trust. Fearing her board would remove her if they learned of her condition during a critical corporate merger, Evelyn hires Thomas as her discreet personal handler, offering life-changing pay and medical insurance for Sarah in exchange for absolute loyalty. As Thomas helps her navigate exhausting board meetings, gala events, and daily pain while concealing her injuries, they develop mutual respect despite their vastly different worlds. Thomas repeatedly protects Evelyn from public collapse, including saving her during a charity gala when her injuries nearly overwhelm her, while Evelyn ensures Sarah receives the best asthma treatment and begins to see life beyond corporate success. After the merger succeeds and Evelyn recovers, Thomas is promoted to Director of Executive Logistics, gaining financial stability without sacrificing his integrity. Their relationship remains built on trust, gratitude, and quiet friendship, proving that compassion and loyalty can bridge even the widest social divide and transform both lives. Fluorescent lights hummed a low, migraine-inducing pitch against the sterile office walls. A vacuum cord tangled around a tired man's heavy work boots. One wrong turn down the executive hallway, one unlatched mahogany door. That was all it took for an invisible maintenance worker to crash into a billionaire's heavily guarded reality. The industrial lemon cleaner didn't smell like real lemons. It smelled like chemicals and desperation, a sharp artificial tang that clawed at the back of Thomas's throat. He dragged the heavy mop across the polished marble of the 42nd floor, the wet strands slapping against the baseboards with a rhythmic wet thwack. It was 11:14 p.m. on a Tuesday. The city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows was a sprawling grid of orange sodium lights and moving headlights, but inside Apex Holdings the air was stagnant, cold, dry, and filtered through miles of aluminum ductwork. Thomas stopped to lean his weight against the aluminum mop handle. His lower back screamed, a dull, throbbing ache radiating from his lumbar spine down to his right knee. He was 34, but his joints felt 50. The dark blue polyester uniform clung to his shoulder blades, stiff with dried sweat and smelling faintly of stale coffee. The remnants of a spilled cup he'd scrubbed out of the break room carpet 3 hours ago. He dug a callous thumb into his eye socket, trying to rub away the grit. He wasn't thinking about the multi-billion-dollar acquisitions that happened on these floors during the day. He didn't care about the market shares or the stock prices crawling across the ticker screens in the lobby. Thomas was doing mental math. Rent was due in 4 days. $80 short. The overtime tonight covered $40. If he picked up a weekend shift at the diner, that was another $50. It left enough for milk bread and maybe, just maybe, the asthma inhaler refill for Sarah. Sarah. The thought of his 7-year-old daughter sent a familiar heavy pang through his chest. She was asleep right now, curled up on the sagging floral sofa in Mrs. Gable's apartment 2 floors down from their own. He pictured the way she gripped the edge of her fleece blanket, the slight wheeze in her breath when the radiator made the apartment air too dry. He hated leaving her there. He hated the pity in Mrs. Gable's eyes when he handed over a wad of crumpled $5 bills every Friday. But a single dad with a high school diploma and a bad knee didn't have the luxury of pride. Thomas hoisted the heavy plastic bucket, the dirty water sloshing against the rim, and moved toward the service elevator. The wheel squeaked a high, irritating pitch that echoed down the empty corridor. He keyed his badge against the scanner. A sharp beep, a green light. The doors parted. His route sheet, crumpled in his back pocket, said he was supposed to finish the 42nd floor and clock out. But the night manager, a perpetually sweaty man named Greg with a clipboard and a complex, had caught him in the locker room. Top floor needs a sweep, Tommy. Someone left a mess in the boardroom. Don't touch the desk in the main office. Just empty the bins and get out. The 50th floor, the penthouse suite, the domain of Evelyn Croft. Even the night crew spoke of the CEO in hushed, cynical tones. She wasn't just a boss. She was an abstract concept of power. A woman who gutted failing tech startups, sold them for parts, and fired thousands without a flinch. Thomas had seen her once months ago. She had walked past him in the lobby surrounded by men in sharp suits. He remembered the sharp click of her heels against the granite, the faint scent of something expensive and floral, bergamot maybe, and cold cedar. She hadn't looked at him. To her, he was just part of the architecture, a moving fixture in a blue shirt holding a trash bag. That was how he preferred it. Invisibility was safe. Invisibility meant he kept his job. The elevator chimed softly. The doors opened to the 50th floor, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. Down below, the carpet was thin industrial meant to withstand thousands of scuffing shoes. Up here, the carpet was a plush dark charcoal that swallowed the sound of his boots entirely. The fluorescent glare was replaced by warm recessed lighting that cast soft shadows against walls paneled in real mahogany, not veneer. Thomas left the mop bucket in the vestibule. He unclipped the heavy black trash bag from his belt and grabbed his microfiber cloth. His pulse ticked up fraction of a beat. He wasn't supposed to be here. He hated being in the executive spaces. It felt like trespassing in a museum where you couldn't afford a single artifact. He walked down the silent corridor. The air up here smelled different. Not ozone and stale coffee, but expensive leather lemon oil and the faint lingering trace of ozone from high-end servers. The boardroom was easy. 3 crumpled coffee cups, a stack of shredded documents, and a whiteboard wiped clean. He tied off the trash bag, the plastic crinkling loudly in the dead quiet of the room. He checked his watch. 11:45 p.m. If he hurried, he could catch the 12:10 a.m. bus, save himself a mile of walking in the sleet, and be in bed by 1 Huzero. He stepped out of the boardroom and looked down the hall at the final door. Evelyn Croft, Chief Executive Officer. The brass nameplate caught the dim light. The door was closed but not latched. A thin sliver of yellow light bled out from the crack, spilling onto the charcoal carpet. Thomas hesitated. The managers always said her office was off-limits unless specifically requested, but Greg had said to empty the bins. If he left the full trash can in the CEO's office, Greg would dock his pay. If he went in and disturbed something, he could be fired. He stood there for 5 seconds, his jaw clenched, weighing the risk. The building was empty. Security had signed out the executives hours ago. She was probably long gone. The light left on by a careless assistant. He reached out his rough, calloused fingers, gripping the cool brass of the door handle. He pushed it open, expecting the empty cavern of silence of an executive tomb. The heavy oak door swung inward on silent hinges. Thomas took a step forward, the black trash bag rustling against his leg. His eyes focused on the floor to locate the wastebasket. He didn't look up immediately. He saw a pair of black stilettos kicked haphazardly onto the Persian rug, then a puddle of dark fabric, a tailored suit jacket thrown over the arm of a leather chair. "I told you to leave it at the desk, Marcus," a voice said. It was a woman's voice, low, raspy, edged with a dangerous exhaustion. Thomas froze. His heart slammed into his ribs, a hard, violent thump that knocked the breath out of his lungs. He snapped his head up. Evelyn Croft was standing 10 feet away, bathed in the glow of a single brass desk lamp. She wasn't sitting behind her massive glass desk. She was standing into the middle of the room, and she was half naked. The expensive, razor-sharp silk blouse she must have been wearing all day was unbuttoned, slipping off one pale shoulder. But that wasn't what paralyzed Thomas. It was the fact that her hands were twisted behind her back fingers, straining to unclasp something tight and mechanical wrapped around her torso. It was a rigid, heavy-duty medical corset. Thick straps of black canvas and metal boning clamped tightly around her ribs and lower spine. As she moved, her skin shifted beneath it, revealing a landscape of mottled, ugly bruises, deep purples and sickly yellows, fading into the pale skin of her ribcage. Thomas didn't move. He didn't breathe. The trash bag in his hand felt like it weighed 100 pounds, dragging his arm down. His brain short-circuited, terrified primal panic, drowning out all rational thought. "I'm fired. Oh my God, I'm going to lose everything." Evelyn turned her head, irritated by the lack of response. She stopped. She didn't scream. She didn't gasp and cover herself like a woman in a cheap movie. Her hands simply fell away from the clasps of the brace, dropping to her sides. For 3 excruciating seconds, the silence in the room was absolute. The faint hum of the city traffic 50 floors below seemed to vanish. Thomas stared at her. Evelyn stared at him. Her eyes were dark bloodshot at the corners, framed by strands of dark hair that had escaped a severe updo. Her face was a mask of cold, terrifying calculation. She looked at his cheap uniform. She looked at his face, pale and wide-eyed beneath the brim of his blue cap. She looked at the trash bag dangling from his trembling fist. "You aren't Marcus," she stated. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a scalpel. Thomas choked. His throat was sandpaper. "I'm sorry. The door. The manager told me." He stepped backward, his heel catching on the edge of the Persian rug. He stumbled, catching his balance clumsily. He kept his eyes locked on her face, terrified that if he looked down, if his gaze drifted even an inch toward the bruises on her ribs or the mechanical brace gripping her torso, she would have him arrested. "Get out," she said. The command was flat, devoid of emotion. "I didn't know you were here." Thomas stammered, his chest tight with panic. The thought of the $80 he needed for rent vanished, replaced by the terrifying image of an eviction notice. "I swear to God, ma'am, I didn't see anything. I was just doing the bins," I said. Evelyn repeated her tone, dropping an octave. "Get out." Thomas didn't wait. He yanked the heavy door backward, almost tripping over his own feet as he scrambled into the hallway. The door slammed shut with a heavy final click, leaving him alone in the dim corridor. He leaned against the mahogany-paneled wall, his breathing ragged loud in his own ears. A cold sweat had broken out across his forehead. The microfiber cloth slipped from his fingers, landing soundlessly on the plush carpet. Stupid, stupid, stupid. He squeezed his eyes shut, pressing the heels of his palms against his temples. He had just walked in on the CEO of Apex Holdings. He had seen something she clearly didn't want anyone to see. A billionaire didn't wear a heavy-duty rib brace unless something was deeply fundamentally wrong, and people with that much money didn't like people like Thomas knowing their secrets. He waited for the sound of a phone ringing. The muffled voice of Evelyn Croft calling security to have the creeping janitor escorted out of the building and stripped of his badge. A minute passed, then 2. Nothing. The hallway remained dead silent. Thomas slowly bent down and picked up his cloth. His hands were still shaking. He retreated to the elevator, practically sprinting the wheels of his mop bucket, screaming as he dragged it back toward the service bay. He needed to clock out. He needed to leave before security came down to the basement locker rooms. By the time he hit the cold, bitter air of the street, the sleet had turned into a freezing rain. Thomas pulled his thin jacket tighter around his neck and started walking toward the bus stop, his bad knee throbbing with every step. He replayed the moment in his head. Her cold, bloodshot eyes, the dark bruises blooming against her ribs, the brutal mechanical grip of the brace. She hadn't looked embarrassed. She had looked cornered, like a wolf caught in a steel trap waiting to see if the hunter would raise his rifle. Thomas boarded the empty midnight bus, paying his fare with freezing fingers. He slumped into a plastic seat near the back, watching the blurry city lights smear across the rain-slicked window. He told himself it was over, an accident. A clerical error in the night manager's routing. Tomorrow he would probably find his badge deactivated. He'd have to beg Greg for a severance check borrowed against next month's groceries, and find another graveyard shift scrubbing toilets for minimum wage. He rested his head against the vibrating glass of the bus window, the diesel engine rumbling beneath him. He didn't know that 50 floors up in an office smelling of bergamot and old money. Evelyn Croft was sitting in her leather chair in the dark, the unfastened brace resting on her desk. She was holding a glass of neat scotch, looking at the door and memorizing the exact shade of terrified, desperate panic she had seen in the janitor's eyes. The alarm clock buzzed at 4:30 p.m. It wasn't a digital chime. It was an old mechanical rattle that vibrated against the chipped veneer of the nightstand. Thomas slammed his hand down on the plastic button, his palm stinging. He lay in the semi-darkness of the bedroom, staring at the water stain on the ceiling. It looked like a deformed continent. His knee throbbed in time with his heartbeat, a dull, familiar companion. He listened. From the living room, he heard the faint, high-pitched wheeze of Sarah's breathing. She was coloring, the scratch of a crayon against cheap printer paper. Thomas dragged himself up. He didn't feel rested. The panic from last night had calcified into a heavy, leaden dread in his stomach. Today was the day. He would walk into Apex Holdings, swipe his plastic badge, and the light would flash red. Security would intercept him. They would hand him a cardboard box with his spare work boots and his thermos, and they would walk him to the curb. He spent 20 minutes in the shower, letting the tepid water beat against the back of his neck, trying to wash away the feeling of impending ruin. He made Sarah a bowl of generic cornflakes. He packed her a lunch with the heels of the bread loaf. "Daddy, you look gray," Sarah said around a mouthful of cereal. Her small legs kicked against the rung of the kitchen chair. "Just tired, bug." he lied, forcing a tight smile. He kissed her forehead. Her skin was a little too warm. He swallowed hard, pushing down the terror. By 10:00 p.m., Thomas was standing in the sleet outside the glass monolith of Apex Holdings. He pulled his collar up, staring at the revolving doors. He felt like a man walking to the gallows. He walked in. The lobby was a cavern of polished granite and forced air smelling of floor wax and ozone. He approached the employee turnstile. His hand shook as he pulled the lanyard from his pocket. He pressed the plastic card against the black glass of the reader. Beep! The LED flashed green. The metal bar gave way. Thomas blinked. He pushed through his heart, stuttering. A glitch. Had human resources not processed the termination yet? He made it down to the basement locker room. The air smelled of damp wool and industrial bleach. Greg was standing by the punch clock, his clipboard tucked under a sweaty armpit. Greg looked up, his eyes narrowing as he spotted Thomas. "Here it comes." "Thomas," Greg grunted, chewing on a thumbnail. "Leave the cart." Thomas stopped, his hand hovering over his locker dial. "Look, Greg, about last night. I can explain." "I don't care," Greg interrupted, looking distinctly uncomfortable. He pointed a stubby finger toward the ceiling. "You're not on floor duty tonight. You're wanted upstairs. 50th. The floor dropped out of Thomas's stomach. The executive floor. They weren't just firing him. They were making an example of him. "Who?" Thomas asked, his voice rough. "The assistant, Mr. Hayes. Said you're to go straight up. Don't clock in. Just go." Greg turned away, muttering something about the union under his breath. Thomas left his cap on the bench. He walked to the service elevator, the silence deafening. The ride up took exactly 42 seconds. He counted them. The doors parted. The charcoal carpet swallowed his footsteps again. The air was cold, smelling of that same expensive bergamot and cedar. A man in a razor-sharp gray suit was waiting for him in the vestibule. Mr. Hayes. He looked like a mannequin carved from ice, Thomas Hayes said. It wasn't a question. "Follow me." Hayes didn't lead him to a security office. He led him down the main corridor, past the empty boardroom, straight to the heavy mahogany door with the brass nameplate. Evelyn Croft. Hayes opened the door and gestured for Thomas to step inside. Then Hayes pulled the door shut behind him. The office looked different in the ambient light of the city, glowing through the massive windows. It was immaculate, intimidating. Evelyn Croft was sitting behind the vast expanse of her glass desk. She wore a tailored black blazer, her posture impossibly rigid. Her hair was pulled back tight. She was looking at a tablet, her face illuminated by the harsh blue light. She didn't look up when he entered. Thomas stood on the Persian rug. The silence stretched tight as a piano wire. He could hear the faint hum of the HVAC system. He shifted his weight, his bad knee twinging. "I'm sorry." Thomas blurted out the words, tasting like copper in his mouth. "I know I wasn't supposed to be here. I'm sorry I saw sit down." She cut him off. Thomas snapped his mouth shut. He looked at the white leather chairs opposite her desk. He hesitated, acutely aware of the grime on his work pants. He sat on the edge of the cushion, his back stiff. Evelyn finally looked up. Her eyes were sharp, devoid of the bloodshot exhaustion from the night before. But the skin beneath them looked bruised, heavily concealed by makeup. "You didn't run to the press," she said. It was a statement. "No. You didn't tell your manager." "No." "Why?" Thomas stared at her. The question felt like a trap. "Because I need this job. I scrub toilets for $15 an hour. If I talk about the CEO, I get fired. I have rent. I have a kid. I can't afford to care about your secrets." It was the most honest thing he had said in years. The rawness of it hung in the air. Evelyn held his gaze. She didn't blink. Then she reached into a desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder. She tossed it onto the glass desk. It slid to a halt an inch from Thomas's hands. "I had Hayes run a background check on you this morning. Thomas Miller, 34, honorable discharge from the infantry medical. Blew out your knee in a training exercise. Single father. Debt to a local clinic for pediatric asthma treatments. Credit score in the low 500s. No criminal record. Desperate." Thomas felt his face flush hot with humiliation and sudden spiking anger. His hands curled into fists on his thighs. "You don't get to—" "I was in a helicopter crash 4 months ago," Evelyn said. The sudden shift in topic slammed the brakes on his anger. She leaned back in her chair. The movement was painfully slow, careful. Pilot error. We went down hard in the Cascades. The press thinks I was on a spiritual retreat in Kyoto. The board of directors thinks I had a minor ski accident. The reality is that I fractured 3 vertebrae and shattered 4 ribs. Thomas didn't say anything. The image of the mechanical brace flashed in his mind, the ugly, mottled bruising. The board is looking for blood, she continued, her voice flat, clinical. Apex Holdings is in the middle of a hostile takeover of a logistics firm. If the shareholders find out the CEO is held together by canvas and metal, unable to sit in a chair for more than 2 hours without narcotic painkillers, the stock will tank. They will invoke a medical clause in my contract and vote me out by Friday. Why are you telling me this? Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. Because I am paying off 3 private physicians, an entire flight crew, and a private clinic to keep their mouths shut. My personal assistant, Hayes, manages my schedule to hide my physical therapy. But Hayes is 130 plus soaking wet. He can't help me out of a car when my spine locks up. He can't tighten a thoracic brace. She leaned forward, bracing her elbows on the desk. She winced, a tiny, almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw. I need someone who is discreet, someone who is entirely off the grid of my corporate circle, someone who needs money so badly they will do exactly what I say when I say it and never ask questions. She looked at his dirty hands. I need a handler. Thomas stared at her. You want me to be your nurse? I want you to be my shadow, she corrected. You drive the private car. You carry the bags. You stand in the corners of gala rooms with my medication. And when my back gives out, you hold me upright so the cameras don't see me fall. Thomas let out a short, cynical breath. I'm a janitor. I have a bad knee. You were infantry. You know how to carry dead weight. She tapped the folder. I will pay you $3,000 a week in cash. You get full corporate medical insurance for you and your daughter effective immediately. $3,000 a week medical. The numbers hit Thomas like a physical blow. That was more than he made in 3 months. That was a new apartment. That was the expensive inhalers, the specialist doctors. The crushing weight of poverty that had been suffocating him for 5 years suddenly cracked, letting in a blinding, terrifying sliver of air. What's the catch? He asked, his voice shaking. You belong to me, Evelyn said, her eyes dead serious. No days off until the merger closes in 6 weeks. If you slip up, if you talk, if you look at me with pity, I will ruin you. I will make sure you can't get a job sweeping streets in this city. Thomas looked at the billionaire. He saw the cold arrogance, the ruthless control. But beneath the edge of her collar, he saw the faint imprint of the canvas strap digging into her collarbone. She was terrified. She was bleeding out in a shark tank, paying the nearest peasant to act as a tourniquet. He didn't like her. He didn't want to be in her world. When do I start? He asked. The transition was violent. On Wednesday, Thomas was scrubbing urinals. On Friday, he was wearing a bespoke black suit that cost more than his car, standing beside a black armored SUV in the underground executive garage. The suit didn't fit his frame properly. It was tailored, but Thomas had the broad, blocky shoulders of a laborer, and the wool pulled tight across his back. The collar scratched his neck. He felt like a dog shoved into a sweater. The first 2 weeks were a grueling lesson in the brutal logistics of immense wealth. Evelyn Croft didn't live a life. She executed a military campaign. Her day started at 5:00 a.m. and ended past midnight. She moved between high-rise boardrooms, private restaurants smelling of truffle and stale cigar smoke, and a penthouse apartment that felt more like a museum than a home. Thomas was the invisible machinery keeping her upright. He learned the subtle cues. When her left hand gripped the edge of a table so hard her knuckles turned white, it meant the nerve pain in her spine was firing. When her voice dropped to a terrifyingly quiet whisper during negotiations, it meant she was fighting off a wave of nausea from the painkillers. Their dynamic was not friendly. It was transactional, abrasive, and fraught with a silent mutual resentment. Slower over the speed bumps, Miller. She snapped from the back seat of the SUV one rainy Tuesday. I didn't hire you to test the suspension. The suspension is fine, Thomas replied, gripping the steering wheel. The city hasn't paved this road since the 90s. Do you want me to reroute and make you 10 minutes late for the acquisitions meeting? I want you to do your job without the commentary. She shot back, her voice tight with pain. He glanced in the rearview mirror. She had her eyes closed, one hand pressed hard against her lower ribs. Her face was gray in the passing streetlights. Thomas felt a flicker of something not pity. He knew better than that. But a grim solidarity. Pain was pain. It didn't care about the zeros in your bank account. The hardest part wasn't the driving. It was the evenings. When the doors to her penthouse finally locked, the CEO facade crumbled. Without the eyes of the board on her, the adrenaline evaporated, leaving only the shattered wreckage of her body. It was during the third week that the boundary between them fundamentally shifted. They had just returned from a brutal 4-hour dinner with European investors. Evelyn walked into the foyer, her movements stiff, robotic. She made it to the edge of the velvet sofa before her legs simply gave out. Thomas caught her before she hit the floor. He grabbed her under the arms, his heavy boots bracing against the hardwood. She gasped a sharp, ragged sound of agony, her nails digging into the sleeves of his suit jacket. She smelled of expensive champagne and cold sweat. "Don't," she hissed through gritted teeth, trying to push him away. "I can stand." "No, you can't," Thomas said, his voice dropping into the flat, authoritative tone he used to use in the military. He didn't ask for permission. He scooped her up his bad knee, screaming in protest, and carried her to the master bedroom. He set her down on the edge of the massive silk-sheeted bed. She was shaking violently, her breath coming in shallow, panicked bursts. "The brace," she choked out, pointing to her ribs. "It's seized. The clasp is jammed." Thomas knelt in front of her. The physical proximity was jarring. For a week she had been a voice giving orders from the back seat. Now he was inches from her face. He could see the fine lines around her eyes, the exhaustion carved into her skin. He reached under the hem of her blazer, his rough, calloused fingers brushing against the expensive silk of her blouse. He found the cold metal clasps of the thoracic brace. They were heavy-duty ratchets, the kind used in severe orthopedic trauma. The locking mechanism on the left side had bent inward, digging brutally into the bruised flesh of her ribs. "I have to force it," Thomas said, looking up at her. "It's going to hurt." Evelyn stared at him, her eyes wide, terrified, and entirely human. She nodded once. Thomas gripped the metal lever. He braced his forearm against the rigid canvas, taking care not to press on her skin. He pulled. The metal resisted, then gave way with a loud snap. Evelyn let out a choked sob, her forehead dropping forward to rest heavily against Thomas's shoulder. He froze. He was a janitor. She was a billionaire. He was acutely aware of his cheap deodorant and the lingering smell of exhaust on his clothes. But he didn't pull away. He stayed perfectly still, letting her breathe, letting her hide her face against his cheap suit jacket. Slowly, carefully, he unlaced the rest of the corset. He pulled the heavy, sweat-dampened canvas away from her torso and set it on the floor. She sat back, pulling her blouse tight across her chest, her breathing slowing. The silence in the bedroom was thick, heavy with the vulnerability of the moment. "Thank you," she whispered, looking at the wall rather than at him. "You're welcome," Thomas said. He stood up, his knee cracking loudly in the quiet room. He turned to leave, but he heard the rustle of paper. He looked back. Evelyn was holding a folded piece of paper that had fallen out of his suit pocket when he knelt down. It was a drawing. Stick figures in crayon. A tall man in blue, a little girl with a green balloon. Evelyn looked at the drawing, her thumb brushing over the jagged crayon lines. "Sarah." "Yeah," Thomas said, feeling a sudden fierce protectiveness. He reached out and took the paper from her hands. "My daughter. Is she—" Evelyn hesitated, the sharp corporate edge entirely gone from her voice. "Is the insurance covering the treatments?" "Yeah," Thomas said softly. "She got the good inhalers on Monday. She hasn't wheezed in 3 days. Evelyn looked at him. Really looked at him. She saw the dark circles under his eyes, the permanent tension in his shoulders. She saw a man who was selling his soul and his dignity to keep a child breathing. "Good," she said quietly. "Make sure Hayes schedules you off on Sunday. You should take her to the park." Thomas stared at her, surprised. He nodded slowly. "Good night, Miss Croft. Evelyn," she said to his back as he walked out the door. "When it's just us. Miller, it's Evelyn." The Metropolitan Museum smelled of White Lily's expensive gin and the suffocating arrogance of old money. It was the final social hurdle before the logistics merger. Thomas stood near a marble pillar, the collar of his procured tuxedo scraping his neck. His eyes stayed locked on Evelyn. She wore a high-waisted emerald gown structured meticulously to hide the rigid canvas brace underneath. She held a flute of champagne she wasn't drinking. She had been standing for 3 hours. Thomas watched her left hand drift toward a high-top cocktail table. Her fingers gripped the linen cloth. Her knuckles went bone white. "She's failing." Richard Caldwell, a predatory board member, approached her with 2 associates. They smiled. But it was the smile of wolves testing a weak fence. If she showed vulnerability now, they would pause the merger. They would demand a medical review and force her out. Thomas didn't wait for a signal. He moved. He cut through the crowd, stepping smoothly to Evelyn's left side, placing his broad frame between her and Caldwell, just as the man opened his mouth. "Ms. Croft Thomas," said his voice flat and loud enough to interrupt. "Tokyo Operations is holding on line 1. They need immediate authorization on the freight routing." Caldwell scowled. "We are in the middle of a discussion, young man." Thomas looked at him, unblinking. "I apologize, sir. Tokyo won't wait." "Ms. Croft." He offered his arm. The moment her hand rested on his sleeve, Thomas felt the terrifying degree of her exhaustion. She was practically in freefall. I took 90% of her weight, steering her away from the predators out of the grand hall and down a dim corridor. He pushed open the heavy door of an empty coat room and locked it. Evelyn immediately collapsed against the wall. The champagne flute shattered on the tile. She slid to the floor, gasping, her nails digging into the silk over her ribs. Tears of pure, humiliating agony ruined her makeup. "I can't," she choked. "The bone is shifting." Thomas dropped to his knees in the broken glass. He didn't care about the tuxedo. He pulled a silver pill case from his pocket, uncapped a water bottle from a catering cart, and handed her 2 white tablets. She swallowed them dry with shaking hands. Thomas sat beside her on the floor, pulling his knees up. The room smelled of damp wool, heavy perfume, and spilled wine. "You saved me," she whispered to the dark ceiling. "I did my job," Thomas replied, staring at his boots. "No," Evelyn said, her voice completely stripped of its corporate armor. "You saw me drowning and you pulled me out." Thomas looked at her. "We're both just trying to survive, Evelyn. Your monsters just wear nicer suits than mine." 6 months later, the canvas brace was gone. The merger had made Apex Holdings untouchable. Thomas didn't go back to pushing a mop bucket. He had a fabricated title director of executive logistics and a real desk on the 49th floor. He still hated the corporate world. Evelyn was still a ruthless, demanding CEO who fired people without blinking. They argued constantly. But as Thomas drove his daughter home in a sensible sedan on a sunny Friday afternoon, Sarah breathing easily, chattering happily about dinosaurs, his phone buzzed in the cup holder. "Take her for ice cream. Put it on the corporate card." Thomas let out a short, real laugh. He tossed the phone onto the passenger seat and turned on the radio. The city didn't look so terrifying anymore. Sometimes the ghosts in the machine finally got to step into the light. Did this raw, unexpected story keep you hooked? Sometimes the most powerful connections happen when the masks finally crack.